So I'm going to read a little bit from Aztec Myths and Legends. I left off here at a persistent tradition. The theory of the present author concerning Toltec historical existence is rather more non-committal. He admits that a most persistent body of tradition as to their existence gained general credence among the Nahua, and that the date 1055 of their alleged dispersal admits of the approximate exactness and probability of this body of tradition at the time of the conquest. He also admits that the site of Tolan contains ruins which are undoubtedly of a date earlier than that of the architecture of the Nahua as known at the conquest, and that the numerous evidences of an older civilization exist. He also believes that the early Nahua, having within their racial collection existed as savages, the time which elapsed between their barbarian condition and the more advanced state which they achieved was too brief to admit to evolution from savagery to culture. Hence they must have adopted an older civilization, especially as through the veneer of civilization possessed by them, they exhibited every sign of gross barbarism. A nameless people. If this be true, it would go to show that a people of comparatively high culture existed at a not very remote period of the Mexican tableland, but what their name was or their racial affinity, the writer does not profess to know. Many modern American scholars of note have conferred upon them the name Toltecs, and speak freely of the Toltec period and of Toltec art. It may appear pedantic to refuse to recognize that the cultured people who dwelt in Mexico in pre-Nahua times were the Toltecs, but in the face of the absence of genuine and authoritative native written records dealing with the question, the author finds himself compelled to remain unconvinced as to this exact designation of the mysterious older race which preceded the Nahua. There are not wanting authorities who appear to regard the pictorial chronicles of the Nahua as quite as worthy of credence as written records. But it must be clear that the tradition, or even history set down in pictorial form, can never possess that degree of definiteness contained in a written account. Toltec art. As has been stated above, the Toltecs of tradition were chiefly remarkable for their intense love of art and their productions in its various branches. Ishlichokchitli says that they worked in gold, silver, copper, tin, and lead, and as masons employed flint, porphyry, basalt, and obsidian in the manufacture of jewelry and objects d'art they excelled, and the pottery of Cholula, of which specimens are frequently recovered, was of high standard. The other Aboriginal peoples. Mexico contained other Aboriginal races besides the Toltecs. Of these many and diverse peoples, the most remarkable were the Otomi, who still occupy Guanajuato and Querétaro, and who, before the coming of the Nahua, probably spread over the entire valley of Mexico. In the south we find the Huasteca, a people speaking the same language as the Maya of Central America, and on the Mexican Gulf, the Totonacs and the Chontals. On the Pacific side of the country, the Mixteca and Zapoteca were responsible for a flourishing civilization, which exhibited many original characteristics, and which in some degree was a link between the cultures of Mexico and Central America. Traces of a still older population than any of these are still to be found in the more remote parts of Mexico, and the Mixe, Sake, Quicatec, and Popolcan are probably the remnants of prehistoric races of vast antiquity. The cliff dwellers and a connection to the Pueblo Indians. It is probable that a race known as the cliff dwellers, occupying the plateau country of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, and even extending in its ramifications to Mexico itself, was related ethnologically to the Nahua. The present-day Pueblo Indians dwelling in the north of Mexico most probably possess a leaven of Nahua blood. Ere the tribes who communicated this leaven to the whole had intermingled with others of various origin, it would appear that they occupied with others whose tracts of country now inhabited by the Pueblo Indians, and in the natural recesses and shallow caverns found in the faces of the cliffs, erected dwellings and fortifications, displaying an architectural ability of no mean order. These communities extended as far south as the Gila River, the most southern affluent of the Colorado, and the remains they have left there appear to be of a later date architecturally than those situated farther north. These were found in ruins by the first Spanish explorers, and it is thought that their builders were eventually driven back to rejoin their kindred in the north. Farther in the south, in the canyons of the Piedras Verdes River in Chihuahua, Mexico, are cliff dwellings corresponding in many respects with those of the Pueblo region, and Dr. Herdlicka has examined others so far south as the state of Jalisco in central Mexico. These may be ruins of dwellings erected either by the early Nahua or by some of the peoples relatively aboriginal to them, and may display the architectural features general among the Nahua prior to their adoption of other alien forms. Or else they may be the remains of dwellings similar to those of the Tarahumare, a still existing tribe of Mexico, who, according to Lumholtz, inhabit similar structures as at the present day. It is clear from the architectural development of the cliff dwellers that their civilization developed generally from south to north, that this race was cognate to the early Nahua, and that it later withdrew to the north or became fused with the general body of the Nahua peoples. It must not be understood, however, that the race arrived in the Mexican plateau before the Nahua, and the ruins of Jalisco and other mid-Mexican districts may merely be the remains of comparatively modern cliff dwellings, an adaptation by mid-Mexican communities of the cliff dweller architecture, or a local development of its owning to the exigencies of early life in the district. Nahua race. The Nahua race. The Nahua peoples included all those tribes speaking Nahuatlotoli, Nahua tongue, and accompanied a sphere extending from the southern borders of New Mexico to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec on the south, or very much within the limits of the modern Republic of Mexico. but this people must not be regarded as one race of homogeneous origin. A very brief account of their racial affinities must be sufficient here. The Chichimecs were probably related to the Otomi, whom we have alluded to as among the first comers to the Mexican Valley. They were traditionally supposed to have entered it at a period subsequent to the Toltec occupation. Their chief towns were Texcoco and Tenayucan, but they later allied themselves with Nahua in a great confederacy and adopted the Nahua language. There are circumstances which justify the assumption that on their entrance to the Mexican Valley, they consisted of a number of tribes loosely united, presenting in their general organization a close resemblance to some of the composite tribes of modern American Indians. The Al-Akulwake. Next to them in point of order of tribal arrival were the Al-Akulwake, or Akulwans. The name means tall or strong men, literally people of the broad shoulder, or pushers, who made a way for themselves. Gomara states in his Conquista de Mexico that they arrived on the valley from Aculhuacan about AD 780 and founded the towns of Tolan, Culhuacan, and Mexico itself. The Acolhuans were pure Nahua and may well have been the much disputed Toltecs, for the Nahua people always insisted on the fact that the Toltecs were of the same stock as themselves and spoke an older and purer form of the Nahua tongue. From the Acolhuans spring the Tlaxcalans, the inveterate enemies of the Aztecs, who so heartily assisted Cortez in his invasion of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, or Mexico. So I'm gonna do the rest of this video, I think whispered, because someone just came back. The Tecpanecs were a confederacy of purely Nahua tribes, dwelling in towns situated on the lake of Texcoco, the principal of which were Tlacopan and Azcapotzalco. The name Tecpanec signifies that each settlement possessed its own chief house, or Tecpan. This tribe were almost certainly later Nahua immigrants who arrived in Mexico after the Acolhuans and were great rivals to the Chichimec branch of the race. The Aztecs. The Azteca, or Aztecs, were a nomad tribe of doubtful origin, but probably of Nahua blood, wandering over the Mexican plateau for generations. They at length settled in the marshlands near the lake of Texcoco, hard by Tlacopan. The name Azteca means crane people, and was bestowed upon the tribe by the Tecpanecs, probably because of the fact that, like cranes, they dwelt in a marshy neighborhood. They founded the town of Tenochtitlan, or Mexico, and for a while paid tribute to the Tecpanecs, but later they became the most powerful allies of that people, whom they finally surpassed entirely in power and splendor. The features of the Aztecs as represented in the various Mexican paintings are typically Indian and argue a northern origin. The race was and is of Africhite, and the skin is of a dark brown hue. The Mexican is grave, taciturn, and melancholic, with a deeply rooted love of the mysterious, slow to anger, yet almost inhuman in the violence of his passions when aroused. He is usually gifted with the logical mind, quickness of apprehension, and an ability to regard the subtle subtle side of things with great nicety. Patient and imitative, the ancient Mexican excelled in those arts which demanded such qualities in their execution. He had a real affection for the beautiful in nature and a passion for flowers, but the Aztec music lacked gaiety, and the national amusements were too often of a gloomy and ferocious character. The women are more vivacious than the men, but were in the days before the conquest very subservient to the wills of their husbands. We have already very briefly outlined the trend of Nahua civilization, but it will be advisable to examine it a little more closely, for if the myths of this people are to be understood, some knowledge of its life and general culture is essential. Legends of the foundation of Mexico. At the period of the conquest of Mexico by Cortés, the city presented an imposing appearance, led to its neighborhood by Huitzilopochtli, a traditional chief afterwards deified as the god of war. There are several legends which account for the choice of its site by the Mexicans. The most popular of these relates how the nomadic Nahua beheld, perched upon a cactus plant, an eagle of great size and majesty, grasping in its talons a huge serpent, and spreading its wings to catch the rays of the rising sun. The soothsayers, or medicine men of the tribe, reading a good omen in this spectacle, advised the leaders of the people to settle on the spot, and hearkening to the voice of what they considered divine authority, they proceeded to drive piles into the marshy ground, and thus laid the foundation of the great city of Mexico. An elaboration of this legend tells how the Aztecs had, about the year of 1325, sought refuge upon the western shore of the lake of Texcoco, in an island among the marshes, on which they found a stone, on which 40 years before one of their priests had sacrificed a prince of the name of Copal, whom they had made a prisoner. A nopal plant had sprung from the earth, filled crevice in this rude altar, and upon this the royal eagle, alluded to in the former account, had alighted, grasping the serpent in his talons. Beholding in this a good omen, and urged by a supernatural impulse which he could not explain, a priest of high rank dived into a pool close at hand, where he found himself face to face with Tlaloc, the god of waters. After an interview with the deity, the priest obtained permission from him to found the city on the site, from the humble beginnings of which arose the metropolis of Mexico, Tenochtitlan. Mexico at the conquest. At the period of the conquest, the city of Mexico had a circumference of no less than 12 miles, or nearly that of modern Berlin, without its suburbs. It contained 60,000 houses, and its inhabitants were computed to a number 300,000. Many other towns, most of them nearly half as large, were grouped on the islands or on the margin of Lake Texcoco, so that the population of what might almost be called Greater Mexico must have amounted to several millions. The city was intersected by 4 great roadways, or avenues, built at right angles to one another, and laid 4 square with the cardinal points. Situated as it was in the midst of a lake, it was traversed by numerous canals, which were used as thoroughfares for traffic. The 4 principal ways described above were extended across the lakes as dikes or viaducts until they met its shores. The dwellings of the poorer classes were chiefly composed of adobes, but those of the nobility were built of red porous stone, quarried close by. They were usually of 1 story only, but occupied a goodly piece of ground, and had flat roofs, many of which were covered with flowers. In general, they were palace or temples. These were in reality not temples or covered in buildings, but high places, great pyramids of stone, built platform on platform, around which a staircase led to the summit, on which was usually erected a small shrine containing the tutelar deity to whom the Teocalli had been raised. The great temple of Huitzilopochtli, the war god, built by King Ahuitzotl, was, besides being typical of all, by far the greatest of these votive piles. The enclosing walls of the building were 4,800 feet in circumference, and strikingly decorated by carvings representing festoons of intertwined reptiles, from which circumstance they were called Goed Bandli, walls of serpents. A kind of gatehouse on each side gave access to the enclosure. The Teocalli, or great temple inside the court, was in the shape of a parallelogram measuring 375 feet by 300 feet, and was built in 6 platforms, growing smaller in area as they descended. The mass of this structure was composed of a mixture of rubble, clay, and earth, covered with carefully worked stone slabs, cemented together with infinite care, and coated with hard gypsum. A flight of 340 steps circled round the terraces and led to the upper platform, on which were raised 2 3-storied towers 56 feet in height, in which stood the great statues of the tutelar deities and the jasper stones of sacrifice. These sanctuaries, say the old conquistadores who entered them, had the appearance of and odor of shambles, and human blood was bespattered everywhere. In this weird chapel of horrors burned a fire, the extinction of which it was supposed would have brought about the end of the Nawa power. It was tended with a care as scrupulous as that with the Roman Vestals guarded their sacred flame. No less than 600 of these sacred braziers were kept alight in the city of Mexico alone. So, I'm gonna put this here, and then keep on reading in another video. Thank you for watching my videos. That was a little bit from Aztec Myths and Legends. Thank you for subscribing.